I'm going to be talking about an overview of DOC's responsibilities and roles in pest management today. Just talk about the history of introductions into New Zealand. We've got a long history of introducing fish into New Zealand. We've got 19 species of introduced species and 2, or naturalised introduced species, and 2 that don't breed in New Zealand. In the early days they were released to develop recreational fisheries. But since the 1960s, with the exception of grass and silver carp, they've all been illegal releases into New Zealand. I also thought that as the first talk of the day, I should set the scene and define what an invasive fish is. Invasive fish are those that significantly and adversely affect the long-term survival of native species, the integrity or sustainability of natural communities, genetic variation with indigenous species, and any effects on indigenous and recreational freshwater fisheries and their habitats. The other way we can define invasive fish, lots of fish in New Zealand have got designations under lots of pieces of legislation, whether it's the Conservation Act, i.e. the Freshwater Fisheries Regulations, the Biosecurity Act, or Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act. I guess if we remove the species that are managed as recreational sports fisheries, and we take away the species that are coloured blue that are not in New Zealand, and we take away the species that are only in captivity, and then we take away the species that have thought to have been eradicated from New Zealand, and the species that don't breed, we're actually left with 4 main species of invasive fish in New Zealand that we can call pest fish regardless of where they are. Except for rudd. Rudd are a sports fish in the Auckland Waikato region, but for the rest of the country they're a noxious fish. So who is responsible for invasive fish management in New Zealand? The Ministry for Primary Industries is responsible for new incursions, so species that aren't present in New Zealand that come across the border, and the department is responsible as the lead agency for invasive fish within New Zealand, with responsibilities with regional councils, Fish and Game, iwi and MPI. So we get our responsibilities via the Conservation Act and some regulations, the Freshwater Fisheries Regulations that are made pursuant to that Act. We have some responsibilities under the Biosecurity Act, but they have diminished over the last few years. The Conservation Act establishes the department, but it also charges us with protecting and preserving freshwater fisheries and their habitats, and that's recreational ones as well as indigenous fisheries. We have a whole section on freshwater management, and that includes transfer and releases under Section 26 ZM. DOC has a role under there for initial transfers to freshwater and to fish farms and to the public conservation estate, and MPI have a role for subsequent transfers and inter-island permits. And then we've got some administration functions. The Freshwater Fisheries Regulations have some management provisions. Again, there's some transfers provisions. We have some overlapping things. Things sometimes don't match what they do in the Conservation Act, and that's an area of that we have to manage very carefully. The Freshwater Fisheries Regulations also set out the noxious fish provisions. We have a whole part on the management of koi carp. The Freshwater Fisheries Regulations were pre-Biosecurity Act, and so there was a decision made to try and manage the koi carp populations by commercially harvesting within a containment area, but it also allows for recreational fishing. So the containment area goes from just north of Auckland to just south of Hamilton. Within the containment area, it's okay to harvest recreationally and commercially, but outside the containment area, the goal for koi carp management is eradication. Just like to note that when koi carp were first detected in the South Island back in 2000, the department declared them an unwanted organism under the Biosecurity Act, and that now sits slightly at odds with the management of koi in the containment area. But it gave us powers to enter private property and to deal with the incursion in the South Island, which is why we went down that path. So the department has some invasive management principles. The first one is to prevent establishment into New Zealand and into new places within New Zealand. We also want to contain existing populations, and we want to eradicate priority pest populations. And we also need to manage pest populations at priority sites. And the ones in orange are clearly our responsibility, but of course we support MPI in the first one. Just want to talk a little bit about a principle that we use a bit in the department, the difference between a pest-led approach and a site-led approach. If you are going for the species wherever they are. We call that a pest focus, a pest-led focus. If, for example, the koi carp into the South Island, we went after that species no matter which kind of environments it is. A site-led approach is where we're managing pest fish at high priority sites. An example of that might be the work at Lake Serpentine, where we're managing via netting rudd populations to protect a really high value lake because of its high macrophyte communities, native macrophyte communities. Just want to move on to some management actions that have worked really well for the department. We have obviously some legislative guidance and some policy guidance around koi carp and the New Zealand biodiversity strategy. Back in 2000, we obtained some New Zealand biodiversity strategy funding, which was instrumental in setting up the department's pest fish program. It's a very small fund, but it's at least allowed us to get some work happening throughout the country. This was the funding that let us start the national delimitation surveys, the national public awareness campaign, which has been subsequently supported by local initiatives. We've got a response to the South Island incursion in koi, carp and gambusia, and that's worked pretty well. We have no koi records in the South Island anymore. We got rid of them from 5 or 6 sites, and we've got 3 sites of gambusia left. And what's worked really well and where we've been successful is where we have worked well with other agencies early and collaboratively. As I mentioned in my introduction, we did have a successful workshop in 2001, and that set the platform for our pest management principles for invasive fish. We've invested a lot of money and resources into getting rotenone approved for use in New Zealand, and the latest being we've just last year got that approved for all agencies to use, not just the departments. And we've had to support that by standard operating procedures, decision support systems and best practices. We've obviously achieved some eradications. We've reviewed the aquarium species, which led to BNZ, as it was then, tightening up the import health standard in regard to what aquarium species are allowed into the country. We've developed some operational guidance, how to survey for pest fish, some eradication criteria, how to work when you've got diving birds, and some gear cleaning guidelines. We've got an aquatic transfers SOP to help guide which species we're allowed to be moved where, and we've obviously got some noxious fish and koi carp harvest permit guidelines. And we've got a tiny research program where we have had a few publications regarding invasive fish, but we've made a bit of traction working with our Australian counterparts in the CRC and with the Waikato University OBI over the last 10 years. I just want to move on to issues, gaps and challenges. Our biggest issue for me is that we don't have we do have a draft strategic management plan, but we don't have it signed off. And if you don't know what you want to do, how can you know what you're going to do? And so by not having a plan signed off, we're really, as a department, hamstrung. We've got no clear procedures or funding for responding to important incursions. So we don't have, if we have an incursion, because we don't have a plan, people aren't sure what they should do, and then we've got no money to do it, to back that up. Sometimes we're lacking expertise and ability to respond. There is fragmented management and overlapping jurisdiction between agencies that sometimes can be conflicting. And fish are continuing to spread, but often only at a regional level. And I just thought I'd show you the koi carp distribution between 2000 and 2013. Obviously, we're getting creep up into Northland and into the lower North Island. So while we've focused really heavily on keeping them out of the South Island, there's been continual spread throughout the lower North Island and upper North Island. Just continuing on with my issues, gaps and challenges, DOC responses around the country can be variable. Some key founding populations or reports are not being followed up, and that's due to a variety of reasons, whether it's capacity, funding, commitment, priority, interest or skills. And we've had some key jurisdictional issues that are not resolved between MPI and DOC, and some of our legislation that we've had drafted was never completed, just to tidy up those overlapping jurisdictions. It's not all negative, and I don't want to do that, but this is my challenge, I guess, in terms of invasive fish management for New Zealand, is that we need to give clear national direction that compels action. We do need to have clear funding priorities that makes the case for increased investment. And we need to clarify on how to prioritise site or species incursions over other invasive fish and biodiversity work.